Hi, this is Liam Conroy. I was just wanting to give my explanation on my assignment for my different teaching strategies that I decided to use for my ecology course. It's a high school level science elective course. And in particular, the part that I was focusing on, there is a unit that is devoted to human impact, which I take a big interest in, especially with my former occupation with the zoo. And so, endangered species is one thing I like to focus a lot on with my students, and that is the topic that I decided to go with for these different types of teaching strategies. So, to do kind of a rundown of the different strategies that I looked at, the first one that I have here, the instructor centered strategy, was questioning. This is something that I do fairly often with my students. So, the idea with this particular strategy, with this particular unit, um, as I put for the relevant objective, also what are some human causes of animals becoming endangered and the ripple effect of their endangerment on the ecosystem that they will type answers to via a Pear Deck slideshow application. So, for those of you who've never used it before, if you do slideshow presentations like Google Slides, Pear Deck is an application that you can directly integrate into that. And I like using this a lot, especially for students who are less likely to participate out loud. Basically, they can type in their responses and then I can display them with their names being anonymous, and we can have a discussion in class over people's answers, kind of analyzing which ones really hit the mark, which ones might need to be expanded more, to get a better full picture of what we're looking at as far as this particular issue. So I would want to have a total of 10 questions that the students would be answering, and the questions would kind of build off of each other. The first line of questioning would be definitions, like what does it mean for an animal to be endangered versus extinct, or threatened, or least concern. And then we would talk about questions like what causes animals to become extinct, and start to look at both natural causes and human causes. And then finally, the last line of questioning would be the impact that a diminished number of a certain species can have on the environment. This would tie into an earlier unit that we had over basically the way that food is transferred in an environment, how ecosystems interact with one another, to where if you have fewer herbivores or carnivores or omnivores, what's the echo effect? If one organism is diminished in a food web, what parts of the food web that it's attached to will affect them most. So just looking at how other populations would become in flux as a result of it. Then for the interactive strategy, I talked about doing a class discussion. This is one that I've had kind of happen spontaneously sometimes, but with this particular one, I chose to arrange the desks prior to the actual assignment to help facilitate the discussion a little bit more. And I know with discussions that I've had in the past, I've definitely been a lot more involved. And I would be interested to see how my students would perform with one where I was more of a facilitator and less of a direct influence on the conversation. So, excuse me. Um, Basically, the topic in this case would be whose fault is it that animals go extinct? So, thinking about it in terms of a discussion, it's a very open ended question. I would want every student to give their answer to this particular question, and much like our own responses to one another in our own discussion boards, that we could get a thoughtful response from at least two of their peers' answers for full credit for this particular type of assignment, to help encourage discussion between them. So, obviously, students could default to just saying, oh, well, it's humans, and not continue much of a discussion from there. But again, as a facilitator, I would want to say, well, let's analyze some of the things that are directly related to humans that cause this problem. What are we looking at in terms of development or waste disposal, or what are some of the specific things that humans do that can cause this extinction or endangerment to occur? Um, and from that point, even if they're able to come up with a lot of different human answers, just like with the last activity, another point that I could bring up if they feel like they've kind of exhausted the ways that humans can impact species is to talk about, well, there are natural extinctions. If we think about extinction events that we've been able to determined through the fossil record that have occurred before human beings were on the planet. What caused those extinctions? And the big takeaway is going to be that it's the environment that influences extinctions, and looking at the impact that humans have on the environment, that connection. And again, that ties in heavily into this unit of the ecology course, just talking about human impact in general. For an individualized strategy, I went with an independent project, which this is kind of a variation on one that I've done with my students before. I have had my students in the past do a research project on endangered species, and so this is a pretty similar idea that they would be doing an independent research project on one particular endangered species that they would present to their peers via Google Slides. The website that I like to have them use for this particular activity, and what I would recommend for anyone doing an endangered species specific unit, is the IUCN Red List. So the IUCN is an organization that keeps tabs on animal populations and what's causing them to go into fluctuation, and what parts of the world these animals exist in, and some of the specific threats that they're facing. They actually have created the rating system that, based on populations and what the projections are for the future, will determine whether or not a species is considered endangered or worse or better. They're the people that would look at something like, a common rat and say, that's a species that's least concerned, and something like a tiger is endangered or critically endangered. So I have my students select species that are anywhere on that scale between vulnerable and extinct in the wild. I don't let them pick anything that's completely extinct. I prefer to them to think of something that's kind of relevant to this day and age. So they look over, they each pick out a specific animal and have them kind of claim it so that no two students have the same animal, even though they may have similar ones, which is fine. It kind of leads for some conversations about comparisons between some of the species and what may be similar or different for why they're endangered or facing certain issues. And then the idea is that with their Google slideshow presentation, they'd be able to talk about not only their IUCN status, but where they exist in the world, what type of habitat it is, and what some of the specific threats are. Now, the IUCN states most of this pretty outright, but in order to really understand some of the content, some of the students would need to look into other sources of information, because the IUCN just is a quick rundown. So I think it's a good independent research project that, once you start getting into presentations that the whole class is doing, helps everybody get a better overall view. And then finally, for the experiential strategy, I picked the category simulations and games. And this is also kind of a variation of one that I've gotten to do before. That was something that we did to build off the IUCN unit, which is a role play activity. In the case that I've done it before, we picked one of the species that was from the IUCN activity, but really a teacher could pick any particular species that has multiple facets to it as far as people's perspectives on it. The idea is to have students act out different roles of different parties that would be involved in a particular endangered species, whether or not it means trying to preserve it, like if it's an animal rights activist or a wildlife researcher, or if it's someone who the animal may come into conflict with some of the things that they're trying to do, like business development, or if they're citizens that are looking for new places to live, and the housing developments have to be stopped because of these animal habitats being preserved. The idea with this particular role play activity is that the students would inevitably look at these different bullet points that would be various laws, kind of in a town hall type setting, that they would be voting yay or nay on and giving their perspective based on their role. Which, it can be difficult if it comes into conflict with a student's own personal viewpoints, but the idea is for them to be able to understand that these are very human issues and that it's very difficult to get people to agree on one point. So again, it helps kind of give a multifaceted approach to these particular types of issues. As far as any specific issues with trying to pick amongst the different strategies that are possible for this, the biggest thing that I'm looking at is engagement. Obviously, building up from the first example to the last example is really engaging and has people really involved, whereas the first one really doesn't. I think that's one of the biggest things is, obviously something like a role play activity is very engaging, but it's also something you can't do all the time. I do think that a mix is important between them. But if I had to look at what was challenging, is picking, between different strategies to figure out what's the most engaging, what's going to keep student attention the most invested. When you work with, I work in particular with a group that's not there all the time, a lot of ones with truancy issues. So another thing they have to consider is keeping timeframes kind of tight to where a student does miss a couple of days of an assignment. Maybe it won't be that hard for them to make up for it if it wasn't a project that required days upon days of building up. It can be hard sometimes to link it back into previous units as a result of that too. But I think keeping things relatively simple and keeping the main ideas forefront is something that's really helpful in these particular situations. As far as how this would help me in terms of planning instruction for the future, I think it gives me a lot of different angles to explore, especially since I have a lot of instances where a unit in of it itself didn't make a lot of sense to my students. We'll do the activity that's kind of the prior to the unit test activity, and they'll say, we don't know it. We get to the conclusion of it, and they say, we just don't know the content. So I think it's good to be able to say, like, okay, we tried this way, and that didn't work out, but we could try it this way and see if that works any better. And it may have a certain strategy that clicks with certain students a little bit more. And even if it doesn't click with all of them, I think it's easier if some of them get it and they're able to explain it to other students in their own words. Just having as many tools at your disposal as possible seems to be very beneficial. I know that I'm still learning the tools of the trade, but again, I think having more options is certainly better than having fewer options. So I think this gives a lot of different angles to attack particular units from. And you can even gauge with your particular class whether or not you feel like you have more kids that are likely to participate with lots of interactive level activities, or if you have a more reserved class that may be more prone to individual work. If you can kind of gauge what works best for the majority of the class, I think that's also very helpful. All right, well, thank you all for tuning into this presentation on my project. I really appreciate the feedback I've gotten from students in this class, so thanks very much.